Welcome to our viewers and listeners. This is Stay Home, Stay Focused from Interfaith Alliance. I'm Jack Moline. I'm the president of Interfaith Alliance, and my guest today is Mike McCurry, who is a professor at Wesley Theological Seminary. Some of you of a certain age may remember him back from his day as the press secretary in the Clinton White House. Mike, most importantly right now, how are you doing?
You know, we are hunkered down and surviving in the time of coronavirus. It's actually been a lot of fun. Our dogs are especially happy because they're getting nonstop attention from me and from my wife. And our community is in lockdown, Kensington, Maryland, where we live here. But you know, people are out and about. It's actually the interesting thing is there are more people out walking and waving at each other from correct social distance parameters. But you know, there's a more stronger sense of community in some ways in the midst of all of this. So that's an encouraging thing.
That's a good thing. You know, I know that for my entire life, I've never been a pet owner. I have looked outside on nights of misery and seen people walking their dogs and always taken smug satisfaction that I'm not one of them. For the first time in my life, I may regret that I don't have a dog to walk every hour or two, which would be a relief. Mike, we are trying to give our viewers and listeners some sense of what to keep focused on other than keeping themselves and their loved ones safe during this crisis. What's your focus these days?
Well, I think the first thing is to follow all those things that we're told that are important for public health and to avoid, you know, encounters and things that you don't need to be doing, you know, social interactions that you don't need to have. And that, you know, that's a little bit on the depressing side because they're friends that we have. I've become very fond of Zoom meetings. We've had some Zoom cocktails with neighbors of ours, and we all agree on making a certain cocktail, and then we all get on Zoom and chat with each other that way. But there's something about that kind of social distancing that's a little bit inadequate. And otherwise, you know, it's very hard. I teach at Wesley Theological Seminary, as you mentioned, so we are doing all of our classes by Zoom. That's a very, very hard way to try to teach a class, you know, to get people to stay engaged and to be involved. So I've found that to be a little bit on the hard side. Doing a lot of reading. I pulled off the shelf just yesterday the great book, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Right. And that is a great read if anybody is looking for, you know, stuff to read during this time. That one is especially relevant. So I'm just, you know, doing stuff like that. I mowed the lawn for the first time this spring. So, you know, you just kind of find things to keep yourself occupied.
Whatever gives a sense of normalcy in these anything but normal times.
Correct.
You know, you run at Wesley the Center for Public Theology, one of the most intriguing names of a center I've ever heard. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary is exactly that. Public theology is the way in which faith traditions impact the way in which we govern ourselves, in which we conduct our life in what we call the public square. And so we do a lot of work looking at, you know, how do faith traditions impact governance, politics, various issues. And it's, for me, as you can imagine, it's a great combination of both the work that I've done in my faith life, but also the experiences that I had in politics, working, you know, for a long time on Capitol Hill and at the White House and other places. So kind of brings together for me the two aspects of my life that I think have been really defining, which are both faith and politics.
One of the things that I've noticed about my friends and colleagues who are clergy, and particularly clergy who are serving congregations, is that my friends who've been completely at ease talking about politics from the pulpit are now suddenly very focused on comforting their flocks. Whereas the people I'm seeing who have insisted that religious institutions should be exempt from political discussion are all of a sudden weighing in on some of the political ramifications of the restrictions that we have. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I mean, there's always this dilemma, which is in the faith community, are we about salvation and about caring for people's souls, or are we about the community? And how do you define community, and how do you bring the family together? And I think that this is a moment that kind of forces us to realize how we need both, how they come together, they intersect. The work that you do to really nurture someone's spiritual soul has to also relate to how you nurture the community. And we're seeing a lot more of that. And I think for a lot of faith traditions, it focus mostly on salvation, or, primarily, I would say in the evangelical world, that has been a focus. You're seeing suddenly people are waking up and saying, we've got to attend to the community. We have to care about the stranger among us. We've got to bring people in. And so there's this kind of an awakening in some ways, maybe not a great awakening, but at least that there's a renewal of the way in which faith communities can make a difference at a very trying time like this.
A friend of mine who will actually be appearing on this segment in a few days' time told me that, to his surprise and delight, his pastor showed up with an Easter basket for him, and in it were the sacraments so that he could conduct communion for himself at home on Easter Sunday. I thought that was a remarkable way of democratizing a custom, a ritual that has been very hierarchically focused. Very interesting.
We're going into a very, very difficult time. If you think of the three monotheistic traditions, they all have got important moments coming up. We've got Ramadan, we've got Passover, we've got Easter, and all of them are kind of coinciding and conflating to this moment in which we can't be together to celebrate the rituals that normally we would have. And I think that is a very, very hard thing. So I think figuring out how to do that, I mean, we see congregations all over the place figuring out how to do virtual Easter services, online. My wife is doing a choir practice tonight where they're doing it like that. There was a great video that I think everyone has seen from the Chino Valley choir, and they're trying to figure out how they can replicate and do something like that where everybody sings their parts from home, and then you put it all together and mash it up. So it's bringing out some creativity in the midst of all of the despair that we have, and I think that's a very positive thing.
I was also very elevated and inspired by the pastors who have put pictures of their congregants in the pews, both so that when they preach, they have a feeling that they have a congregation, and as well as in sort of a symbolic way, bringing people in who don't have the ability to leave their homes and gather the way they would like. They're just wonderfully creative things. Can I shift a little bit, because you have this remarkable set of talents that I want to exploit here. We have
that's too flattering.
That's all right. It's my show. I can say what I want. We have an election coming up in November, in case anyone's forgotten, and both parties, for different purposes, have conventions scheduled for not so long after the initial estimates of when this virus will begin to abate take place. What are the particular challenges that are presented by these conventions, and what do we do if they don't happen?
Well, as we are talking at this moment today, the Democrats have just announced that they're going to move their convention to August from the scheduled time in July. And I think that's probably necessary. The conventions are wonderful theater. I ran the communications convention operation in Atlanta in 1988, and I can say it was like one of the most fun and exhausting things that I've ever done, because you bring together all these people from different places all across the country, and they're there, and there's a lot of hoopla and hats and funny buttons. But at the end, you're oriented around a purpose, which is to figure out who should be elected president of the United States.
Right.
And so it's a critical moment for political parties to come together. Now, we have some debates about, what is the utility of political parties in America now? Why do we have two political parties and not multiple parties the way they do in other parliamentary systems around the world? And we're going to face a stress test around, is this really the right way for us to organize the work that we do? But I think at their best, these conventions give a way in which people get a platform, they get an idea, they get a sense of what vision what the political parties have for the future of the country. I mean, that's what they ought to be about. I mean, sometimes political parties like to look back on bragging about whatever record they've had, pro or con, instead of really defining aspirationally what we should be doing in the future. And the best politics is always about defining where we're headed and where we're going in the future.
So what would be the messages that you would recommend to the three remaining major candidates, to Vice President Biden, to Senator Sanders, and to President Trump?
Well, I think the most important thing right now is to give us some sense of hope. What is the future going to be like? If you're Biden or Trump or Sanders, I think, has a role to play because he's been uniquely successful at defining an agenda and a platform that the party has awakened to. So he's got a role, even though he's not likely going to be the nominee. But the most important thing is to tell us, after you serve as president for 4 years or 8 years, how will the country be different? What will our future look like? What will have been accomplished, and what will you look back on after your term as president that will really sort of make you satisfied that you've done a good job leading our country? We don't hear a lot. Often our politics is not in that kind of visionary, aspirational mode. And I think that the best candidates are the ones who actually can do that, who can really chart out where we are going to be and what the future will look like, and, what the vision for the country should be about. And we need more of that kind of politics, especially at the kind of time that we're in right now.
It's a great piece of advice, not only for the candidates, but for voters who are looking at the candidates and needing to hear something of significance to them. And,
right.
And hope being one of those important things in a moment of crisis like this. Hope is not necessarily a faith concept, but it is often cast in faith context. You have famously practiced your faith without the usual embarrassment or reticence that a lot of public figures have. And in fact, if I'm correct, didn't you have a deal that you had to be able to return home to teach Sunday school while you were on the campaign trail?
I did. And well, I actually had a deal. I mean, it is now probably not possible anymore, but my White House staff was not allowed to call me on Sundays until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, because that was my Sabbath time. That's when I went to church, and I actually was not teaching Sunday school at that time. That came along later, but that was a time that was really sacred to me for getting off the trail and getting centered and really figuring out. Now, in those days, they didn't have everything online. So at 5 o'clock every afternoon on Sunday, a car drove up from the White House and dropped off all of the transcripts of the Sunday morning shows, which I never watched and never went on, by the way. I mean, I always refused to go on Meet the Press or anything like that. And, you kind of, but that time to kind of think about other things and to be with family and to get away from the hurly-burly of the Washington political world was really probably the thing that, kept me going for 4 years in the job. I mean, I lasted longer as a White House press secretary than most press secretaries traditionally last. And I think as part of it was because I had that Sabbath time.
Well, I'm right with you because I observe Shabbat from Friday night to Saturday night, and my staff
Right.
is also under instructions that if they bother me, it better really be something important, and they're very respectful of that. We all have that opportunity now. It's a little hard to keep track of the days, but to set aside one day and a certain amount of time during that day to withdraw from our concerns about everything is enormously important. You did start teaching Sunday school, and it leads me to a question I hope you've anticipated from our conversations. That is, if you were teaching Sunday school this week or next week, and you may be, what's the lesson you would want to share with your students?
Well, the thing that I would look to are the apocalyptic books, both the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And, because these do seem like the end of times. This does seem apocalyptic in many ways. And I think unpacking those verses and really figuring out what hope endures and what the end times don't mean that, the world is going to end on all of us, that there's really hope beyond, whatever configurations that we have at the moment, and looking at that, because that is the aspirational verses that exist in the Bible are really all about that. So I think that's where I would turn my attention. I mean, then there are also the great passages in the New Testament that we look at as Christians about really taking care of those who are lost, who are homeless, who are in prison, who are hungry. The people who need help. How do you stay focused on helping them?
And those are really important lessons. And those of us who are fortunate enough to still be stable in terms of our income and our resources have a special responsibility, I think, at these times to reach out to people who, even if they have suffered some before, have never suffered the uncertainty that they're looking at right now, because the unemployment rates are skyrocketing in the United States, and who knows what's going to be there for people to return to when this is over. I mean, in that sense, I understand some of the president's nervousness, for whatever reasons he might have it, about maintaining some semblance of the economy, because we have to go back to work when this is all over.
Yeah, just as we are talking today, we learned that another 6.6 million people have filed for unemployment. There's like 10 million people in the last 2 weeks who have, put themselves in an unemployed status, and you could just see how that will reverberate around the economy and around the nation. And then, so what do we in the faith community do to respond to that? I mean, there's going to be an awful lot of people with an awful lot of need, and we've got to be there for them. And
Right.
We've got to figure out what is the right way to bring people into community and to bring them into our congregations and to welcome those who are really hurting, because there's going to be a lot of that, and it's going to last, I fear, for quite some time.
Which actually is a great segue to the last thing I want to ask you, Mike, which is, if you were offering advice to the people who are viewing and listening to this small broadcast about one thing that they could do that would inspire and elevate them in the midst of all of this, what would that be?
Well, the one critical thing is to identify that person in your community or in your walk of life that you really need to go up to and thank. Whether it's the mailman who brings your mail, whether it's the newspaper delivery guy who drops the newspapers off. I still am an old-fashioned guy. I get my newspapers delivered on the front driveway every morning. whether it's the grocery clerk who is taking care of you, even though they're probably exposed to many, many things. But it's that simple act of just a kindness and saying thank you for what you do that I think people appreciate. And, I can't think of no better thing than that, than just remembering how we express gratitude.
Well, I'm going to take your advice right now, Mike, and thank you for being with us and for bringing some respite to people who are watching this or listening to it from home or from circumstances that don't allow them the mobility that they're used to. I appreciate your being here. And to those of you who are viewing and those of you who are listening, stay home and stay focused.
And wash your hands.